Think about it. Your taxes are currently paying the salaries of soldiers who aren't engaged in active combat, who aren't facing an enemy, who might not fire a single shot for years. Why? Because modern states never send their armies home. They never demobilize. Is this normal? No. Is it natural? Absolutely not. This situation would have been considered absurd for most of human history. So what changed? The answer is simple but unsettling. When gunpowder turned war into a permanent expense, states created systems to finance it. And once those systems were established, they were never dismantled. Money doesn't speak. History does. And history tells us this. The modern fiscal system isn't an accident. It's a deliberate response to the price tag of war. For most of human history, war was horrific but cheap. Not morally, but logistically. Armies consisted of men who already existed. Weapons were largely tools they already possessed. Campaigns were seasonal, brief, limited by geography and hunger. Kings didn't need accountants for war. They needed alms, horses, and time. Medieval Europe was fragmented. A web of lords, vassals, and obligations. Armies were temporary. Peasants would be called up, fight, then sent home to harvest crops. Knights provided their own armor. Castles were defensive, not expansionist. War had natural limits because it still depended on people who had to live. No treasury could sustain endless conflict because no treasury needed to. If a ruler pushed too far, armies would disperse, food would run out, loyalty would track. The system enforced restraint without needing laws. Consider the typical medieval campaign. A lord calls his vassals. They arrive with their own equipment, their own horses, their own retainers. They fight for 40 days, the traditional period of feudal service, and then they go home. The harvest can't wait. Winter is coming. Supplies are running low. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. Then came gunpowder. At first it seemed trivial to European elites. Crude cannons were unreliable. Early firearms were slow and inaccurate. Traditional elites dismissed them as noisy curiosities. They were wrong. But not for the reason most people think. Gunpowder mattered not because it killed knights. It mattered because it killed cheap war. Cannons transformed siege warfare overnight. Stone walls that had protected cities for centuries crumbled under sustained bombardment. Fortifications had to be redesigned, thicker, lower, angled. This meant engineers, materials, time, money. The Trace Italienne, the star-shaped fortification, became the standard. But building one required massive earthworks, thousands of laborers, expert military engineers, and years of construction. A single fortress could bankrupt a small principality. Firearms transformed armies. Training a knight took a lifetime. Training a musketeer took months. But only if you could afford the weapons, the gunpowder, the supply chain, and constant resupply. Wars were no longer won by what soldiers carried on their backs, but by what states could deliver to the front. War ceased to be local. It became industrial. The logistics became staggering. An army of 10,000 musketeers consumed thousands of pounds of gunpowder per battle. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Magazines had to be built and guarded. The entire character of military conflict shifted from personal valor to industrial capacity. This is where system design enters the picture. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Soldiers were no longer farmers who fought occasionally. They were professionals paid year-round. Armies didn't disband after campaigns. They waited, drilled, consumed resources, even in peacetime. Victory no longer went to the bravest. It went to whoever could keep paying. This was the moment power began to centralize. Local lords couldn't afford cannons. Small kingdoms couldn't maintain fortresses. Feudal obligations weren't enough to finance continuous warfare. Only centralized states with predictable revenue could survive this new reality. Gunpowder didn't just defeat castles, it defeated decentralization. And when rulers realized war now required money, they faced a new problem: where to find it. First came the professionalization of military administration. Suddenly you needed paymasters, quartermasters, commissariat officers, arsenals with permanent staff. War became bureaucratic. Second came the standardization of weapons. When every knight brought his own sword, no centralized production was needed. But when you needed 10,000 identical muskets, you needed state armories and gunsmiths on permanent payroll. Temporary taxes weren't enough. Emergency levies couldn't sustain permanent armies. So states did something radical. They normalized taxation. What was once occasional became perpetual. What was once negotiated became assumed. Subjects no longer owed just loyalty. They owed money. But even this wasn't enough. Gunpowder wars were vast, prolonged, relentless. The cost of cannons, gunpowder, fortifications, ships, and soldiers exceeded what taxes alone could collect. So governments turned to borrowing. This is where the financial system truly enters the story. States began issuing debt, not as a last resort, but as strategy. Bonds financed wars. Credit became a weapon. Money doesn't speak, history does. Bankers and financiers replaced nobles as the king's most essential allies. A government that could borrow could fight longer than one that couldn't, even if the latter was more beloved. War ceased to be limited by people. It became limited only by credit. The Dutch pioneered this system. They created a permanent national debt backed by reliable tax revenue traded on open markets. This allowed them to fight Spain for 80 years. The English copied the model. The Bank of England was founded explicitly to finance war against France. British national debt exploded, but so did British power. When wars could be financed, they could be extended beyond public tolerance. Costs could be spread across decades. Losses could be deferred. Inflation could quietly absorb part of the burden. This is the origin of the modern state. Permanent taxation, standing armies, public debt, centralized authority. None of these were invented from abstract theory. They were invented because gunpowder made war too expensive to wage the old way. This is the true legacy of the gunpowder economy. Not just bigger wars, but financialized war. Violence no longer needed instant consent. It needed liquidity. Today, modern warfare is no longer limited by manpower. It's limited by budgets, aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, logistics networks. These are financial commitments as much as military ones. And just as in the gunpowder age, the question isn't who fights best, but who can keep fighting. The uncomfortable truth is this: restraint rarely comes from morality alone. It comes from cost. When cost is absorbed, deferred, or hidden through finance, restraint weakens. This doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means war is structural. It lives within systems designed to make it sustainable. Money doesn't speak. History does. Debates about debt, inflation, and public finance can never be separated from debates about power. These aren't abstract economic concepts. They're the tools that allow states to project force without immediate collapse. When people ask why governments borrow so much, why military budgets feel permanent, why inflation quietly erodes savings, or why wars seem detached from daily life, the answer isn't hidden in the latest headlines. It's buried centuries deep in the moment when technology made violence too expensive to manage informally. Gunpowder didn't just change war, it changed what power needs to exist. The lesson: when technology raises the price of power, money steps in to fill the gap, and once that bridge is built, it's rarely torn down. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with ruthless consistency. Systems evolve around the costs they must absorb. When those costs are large enough, they reshape everything upstream. Institutions, money, and the lives lived within them. Money doesn't speak. History does. And if you know how to listen, the future looks far clearer than today. Old money,